A living fire haunts the suburbs. Nostalgia fuels a difficult trade. Alice learns about the hidden fire and its keeper. Welcome to Hidden Oaks. It had been several days since the strange light from the sky crashed into the strip of trees behind their home. The woods bordered about 50 to 100 feet on either side of Rice Creek. The creek and surrounding woods wound lazily between two suburban developments and made up a long yet narrow strip of land called Creekview Park. Tony had been up reading bedtime stories to their young children. His wife was a registered nurse who worked rotating day and evening shifts. This meant that about half the time, Tony was home alone for bedtime routines. Tony worked primarily during the day. The family had moved to Minnesota from Washington about 3 years ago, where he had been an engineer for Boeing. A new job and contract with United Defense working on internal recoil mechanisms for self-propelled howitzer guns, such as the M109 Paladin and the M1128, is what brought them here to the Midwest. But Tony didn't bring thoughts or talk of combat artillery or aeronautics to his girls' bedtime. He just brought love and attention. It was often his favorite time spent with them. He wasn't a very large man. He was 5'8" and not thin but also not fat, with narrow enough hips that he could just fit comfortably in the wooden rocking chair his father had built for his girls. This chair to his daughters was oversized, but to him it was just right. It sat in the corner of their room, across from the bunk beds. Here Tony would sit down, each of them on one knee, Kaya, who was 5, on the left, and Josie, 3, on the right. Their golden retriever Marcy would sit down at his side. Settled down in this way, he would read them their bedtime stories. The lights in the room were off, other than the floor lamp near the chair and the starlight shining through the window on the far wall. His girls were getting older. His round, shaved face now sat much closer to their heads than it had what seemed only like months before. Kaya's hair brushed his left cheek. He pushed his black, plastic-rimmed glasses up on his nose and began to read. They loved it when he would do funny voices for the stories. Sometimes he would read like Arnold Schwarzenegger, or other times like Kermit the Frog. Tonight he was reading Three Little Kittens in the voice of Christopher Walken, as he had seen Kevin Pollak do on TV. Three little kittens lost their mittens, and they began to cry. Oh, mother dear, we very much fear. Our mittens we have lost. But before he could start the next line, a bright, blazing light came into view in the sky of their window. The shine glared off his glasses, and he was no longer able to see the page in front of him. His girls gasped simultaneously, hopped off his legs, and ran over toward the window, shouting, "Look, Papa! What is it?" asked Kaya. "I don't know," said Tony, walking over to join them. He reached his hand up and ran it back across his short, curly black hair. He had kept it long in college, and the automatic gesture of pushing it out of his eyes when he was going to look more closely at something was still ingrained in him at times. Marcy had started up and sat down before the window. Looking at the sky outside, she gave a single, sharp bark. The yellow-orange fiery light had drifted across toward the horizon. Now, standing at the window, he could hear that it made a noise. There was a sort of crackling, popping sound as it sparked through the air. It had come over the house and was moving toward the woods behind their home. It glided somewhat lazily, and this is why Tony had felt quite sure it wasn't a meteor. It also wasn't small, whatever it was. An engineer, Tony was good with estimating distances and measurements, and by relation, this thing appeared to be about 3 or 4 feet in diameter as he watched it move away from their home. It almost seemed to slow and then hover once it got over the trees. Then suddenly, it shot down from the sky and into the woods, its light obscured by the foliage. What was clear was that it was still there, burning brightly. The yellow-orange glow still emanated from between leaves and branches. He could see the light dancing around. It appeared to spread. He saw multiple points diverge from the original location. They came to the edges of the trees only to make what appeared to be several small round fires. Each was about the size of a campfire and came to rest at various spots along the edge of the woods. Tony quickly left the room. "Where are you going, Papa?" asked Kaya. "I have to call the firemen," he answered. He dialed 911 and informed the dispatcher what he had seen, stating he thought the fire department should come check on things in case the forest started on fire. It had been an extremely dry summer, and a fire this close to the neighborhood could be devastating. He hung up after the dispatcher told him a fire crew would be on their way as soon as possible. Then he rejoined his children. "The lights went none-night, Papa," said Josie. It appeared that Josie was right. As far as Tony could see, there was no trace of light left in the woods. "I better go check quick so I can point out any smoldering spots to the firemen when they get here. We don't want to let any bad fires start, right? You girls stay here with Marcy. I'll be right back, okay?" "Okay, Papa," said the girls together. He gave them both a hug along with a kiss on the head and went back into the kitchen. He grabbed a flashlight out of the kitchen drawer, put on his tennis shoes, and stepped through the sliding glass door and onto the deck. He only opened the door wide enough for himself to squeeze through, making sure the dog didn't sneak outside with him. It was a relatively cool night for August, and all was still and silent. It was as if the world had taken a great deep breath and held it. He kept the flashlight off for now, walked down the steps of the deck, and headed toward the far edge of his backyard. As soon as he reached the base of the deck, he stopped abruptly. A sudden wave of heat crossed his chest, neck, and face. It washed over him and stayed in a way that seemed to grow strong only to dull before growing stronger again. It was like the glow of an ember, increasing with a slight breeze and then dimming as the wind died down. But he was still more than 70 feet from the edge of the trees where he'd seen the bright glowing light that came from the sky. If it was throwing off that much heat, the trees and grass would be on fire soon enough for sure. But as he advanced, he noticed the heat wasn't really on his skin at all. It seemed to come from within him, especially in his head, where the hot sensation seemed to penetrate deeply. He reached the end of his yard, where the mowed grass stopped and the rough long grass met underbrush from the small forest. He looked left and right, craning his neck to see if he could spot the smoldering areas he was sure he would find after seeing the sparks from the bright light spread to the edges of the trees. But he didn't see any flames, or any embers glowing at all. He clicked on the flashlight and held it high over his head. He began to shine it along through the tall grass that bordered the trees. He wanted to see if he could catch a glimpse of some blackened spots or some wisps of smoke in the air. Again, nothing. Then all at once, the breeze picked up and changed directions. It blew to him from within the forest and brushed across the left side of his face as he walked. As the wind blew, a glint of orange light appeared to flash across the left lens of his glasses, and the strong scent of burning wood wafted to his nose. He clicked off his light and turned just in time to see a wink of what looked like firelight glint from within the trees. He turned the light back on and found the little path he and the kids had worn down through the grass and into the trees. He quickly walked down this trail into the woods. Then he shut the light off once again and looked around. It wasn't a dense forest, and in its middle ran Rice Creek. If there was a fire in here glowing to the outside, he should have an easy time spotting it. But once more, there was nothing. All was dark. He could hear the sirens of what he assumed was the fire truck approaching. The charred smell was dissipating, but the heat in his mind and body had strengthened. It almost burned behind his eyes. He walked back up to their yellow 2-story house. He skirted the deck and came around the side and out to the road just as the fire crew showed up. He waved his arms and hailed them to his spot. And when they got out, he told them he was the one that had called, mentioned again what he had seen and that he'd helped them see where the sparks had landed. The men were suited up and ready for anything. They carried a few big stainless steel fire extinguishers down from the truck out to where Tony led them. The firefighters said they also felt the heat and smelled the charred wood. They began to simply follow the sensation. They would point themselves in the direction where it grew. Where it was the strongest, they found the only strange indication of anything even remotely resembling fire. The only thing, besides the initial flickering light. On the ground, in the flattened grass, was a strange marking. It was a singular shape or symbol about 2 feet across. It appeared to be stenciled in black soot. It reminded Tony of a hieroglyph or some other ancient lettering he had seen in textbooks in high school history class. The men all gathered around it and looked at it for a time. The heat sensation within them all had grown very strong here and was nearly painful. One of the men finally discharged his extinguisher across the entire flattened and scorched piece of ground. Instantly the heat diminished, but did not go away completely. It had been nearly 20 or 30 minutes, and Tony realized he needed to get back inside to his children. He left the firefighters to their work and returned to Kaya and Josie. They were already in bed, with the lights turned out. Josie was holding Boo Boo Bear tight and breathing deeply. Kaya was still awake and whispered to her father as he checked on the 2 girls. He stepped onto the bottom rung of the ladder so he could see up into the top bunk and hear more easily.
"Papa, I tucked Josie in and told her a story. It was the one about the King Teak-Talk and his dragon Bruce. She went right to sleep, just like the fire did out in the woods," she said. "Thanks for doing that, sweetie. I'm sorry I was out there so long." "It's okay, Papa. I love you."
"I love you too, sweetheart. Good night. Go to sleep now, okay?"
"Everything's going to be all right." "Good night, Papa,"
said Kaya as she rolled over in her top bunk. He pulled the blankets up to her shoulders and leaned forward, kissing her on the back of the head. Then he stepped down and did the same for Josie as she soundly slept. He walked out of the room and closed the door quietly. He saw the flashlights of the firemen coming back up the yard and out of the woods. They didn't appear to be in any hurry. They must have finished their work. Marcy was asleep on the living room couch as he walked through. Tony wanted to catch the firefighters to see if they had found anything, so he went downstairs and outside to meet them by the truck. Several other neighbors had gathered around the fire truck, drawn out of their homes by the lights. Tony mentioned what he had seen. A couple of them had also seen the light in the sky that disappeared into the trees, so he knew he wasn't imagining things. The firefighters said that though they had walked around for nearly an hour, they found no embers. There were no fires. Only the marking they had sprayed with the extinguishers when Tony had still been with them. And there was the vague sense of heat lingering about that they felt more in their chests and minds than on their skin. They took statements from the crowd of anyone who had anything to tell, and then they packed everything back up into their truck and left after telling them all to call again if they noticed anything else. Then Tony went back home and went to sleep. Over the next several days, there were small and intermittent strange occurrences that continued to remind Tony of that puzzling night. To Tony, all these things seemed to form a pattern, something his engineering mind was quick to hone in on. One of the biggest characteristics was that every time something happened, that strange internal perception of heat in the head and heart would be present. The hot feelings that would accompany them were sometimes a little harder to pick up on in the rays of the summer sun, but the presence was discernible. The sun warmed the skin from without, while this other sensation was internal and similar to that of placing one's hand too close to the burner of a stove or the licking flames of a bonfire to place a new log. The heat didn't actually physically burn, but was often as close to being painful as it could be. Tony would always end up breaking out in a sweat. Other times he would again see lights or what looked like little round campfires in the trees at dusk, which upon investigation would reveal nothing. The fires were always very small and round. They never spread, and they left no trace of soot or ash when investigated the next day. It wasn't only Tony who took notice of these things. His wife was also very perplexed by all this, and later they would begin to hear even from the neighbors. Tony's wife Jenny believed in ghosts and the paranormal. It was one of the few things they disagreed completely on, but it was usually so unimportant that Tony was just able to ignore it. When he had originally told her about what he and the girls had seen, she felt certain it was some spirit or something that was fulfilling some purpose. She believed that unless it seemed harmful, they should leave it alone and let it do what it needed to do. Tony just rolled his eyes to himself and kept quiet about that aspect of it. After Jenny had seen a few of the light shows herself, she stated to the family that she was going to have a psychic from Uptown come and investigate if the events kept occurring. She had made claims like that a lot. She also sometimes claimed clairvoyance, but only ever in hindsight. Tony never argued it. She had actually used a psychic once before. They had lived in an older house back in Washington, and Jenny had hired a medium to speak with and understand the ghosts that she believed lived there. Tony didn't believe this. He was an engineer, a man of science. He just let it go. She didn't fall for these scams often enough for him to say anything about. Most often these things would happen after sunset, but some of them took place in broad daylight. Creekview Park used to be filled with small wildlife. Since the odd light and heat had come, it seemed like all of these things had vanished. Squirrels and rabbits used to be plentiful, but were no longer seen. Birds had stopped nesting in the trees or flying into the area at all. A few times, Tony's girls had found dead animals lying on the edge of the tall grass bordering the park. They would come find him and bring him to the bodies. He would tell the girls not to touch them and go play somewhere else. When he examined them, he was never able to find a sign of a cause of death. Occasionally, while bringing lawn trimmings or weeds to his compost pile at the back of his yard, he would get a flash of the heat feeling. When he turned to look toward the park, he swore he sensed something small scurry through the grass away from him, but he never saw anything. One day, Marcy was following him as he carried a bucket of garden waste out to the pile. The heat feeling washed over him, and he turned toward the tall grass to his left where his lawn ended. There was nothing there. Marcy had noticed it too. Her hackles were standing on end, and she began to let out a low growl. And just then, something rustled in the grass, and before he could restrain her, Marcy ran off into the grass after it. "Marcy, no!" shouted Tony, but she was off on the chase, not to be distracted. He felt the heat flare inside his mind in waves as the dog ripped through the grass and into the edge of the forest. He also noticed something new. There was a movement in front of his dog, but he couldn't actually see anything occupying the space that was disturbing the grass as it went forward. Then, when the chase reached the edge of the trees, there was noise. Sounds of a ferocious fight broke out in the undergrowth, and Tony began to get worried. What he heard was the snarling of his dog, but also crackling noises, like dry pine knots bursting in a bonfire. He dropped his bucket to the ground. The heat in his head grew to a sudden white-hot burning pain, and he cried out, bending down, shutting his eyes, and putting his gloved hands over his face. Then all was quiet. The intensity of the heat inside his head steadily decreased. Nothing moved for nearly a minute. He stood up and surveyed the edge of the woods and called out Marcy's name a few times. Then something fawn-colored caught his eye emerging from the trees. It was Marcy. She was moving very slowly toward him and limping. He couldn't see her very well through the grass, but he knew it was her. She made a few steps out of the trees and then collapsed. Tony ran over to her. He was happy the kids were out with their mother right now. He didn't want them to see Marcy hurt. She had once cut her leg on the neighbor's fence, and the girls had panicked at the sight of blood. This time, though, it was worse. It was clear to Tony right away that she was already dead. She just lay there limp. The only noticeable injuries were what almost looked like singed hairs along her neck and snout. Also on her snout and in her teeth was what looked like fine, white hair. Tony bent down and pulled some of this off of Marcy and examined it closely. On more direct examination, the substance reminded Tony of the asbestos coatings that he would find while working on the innards of older aircraft when he was back at Boeing. He bent down and gathered more of the substance. He intended to have someone take a closer look at it. He gathered it up and put it into the back pocket of his pants. Tony stood there and thought. He had so many questions. What was happening? This was all so strange. They had originally decided to let it play its course, but now animals were dying. Marcy was dead. How would he tell the kids? Were the kids safe to play outside even? It all started when that light came from the sky. Tony knew he didn't believe in the spirits that Jenny went on about at times, but he saw this thing come from the sky. The kids saw it. Neighbors saw it. It wasn't a dream. Could it be something from space? Jay came down the stairs from his apartment to embark on his familiar route toward Funko Land. Once fall arrived, it would be 2 years since he'd first made the trek with his new roommate and fast friend. And 1 year since he'd disappeared. Jay's roommate was also named Jay. Neither was willing to go by JD or JW. It had begun as a joke, and neither young man was ever willing to let the joke end. He was fun to hang around with from day one. It was as though they'd known each other forever. Jay was usually not so well liked at first. He assumed that his sarcastic humor and less than outgoing nature made him a bit of an acquired taste. But it hadn't been like that with Jay. Maybe he'd had enough ice-breaking power for the both of them. It was somehow very difficult to feel anxious around Jay, a rare quality in anybody, let alone a first roommate. He never questioned it at the time, but his friend had been gone for almost as long as he'd been around now. Jay stopped for the crosswalk. Traffic was light enough that he could have just gone for it, but in honor of all the jaywalking jokes he'd used to share in, he let slip a nostalgic smile and waited instead. It was another muggy Minnesota afternoon. When the sun was out, even the pavement seemed to sweat. When it hid behind a cloud, the thick humidity took its turn to blare. And throughout, whatever wind kept the clouds passing overhead had little effect at ground level. The occasional whiffs of breeze served mainly to remind how very still the air was. When the light changed and indicated it was safe to walk, Jay continued his quest for cheap video games, fondly remembering the many times he'd done just the same thing with Jay. Before he was even halfway across as usual, the little white man disappeared and the big red hand started blinking. Jay had always had something to say about the little white man at crosswalks. On more than one occasion, he suggested people differentiate the pair by calling Jay WJ for White Jay. It always got a laugh, and both knew that in fact he was sometimes referred to as BJ for Black Jay, but he'd only joke like that in friendly situations. They never really talked about skin color. It wasn't supposed to matter after all. That's what all the grade school assemblies and after-school specials said. That's what all the politicians and rich businessmen said. That's not what anything else in life said, though. Even White Jay knew that. As if on cue, a black cat crossed Jay's path. Bad luck according to nobody in particular, and everybody in general. Nonsense. Jay had always liked cats, and even though this one looked a bit rough, its black fur was pretty, not menacing. The cat rubbed against his leg before going about its kitty business, trotting across the corner of one property and squeezing under a fence into another. Jay tried to imagine a life in which seemingly rational people would go out of their way to avoid him, and it put a knot in his stomach, whether he imagined that he was human or cat-shaped. Jay never made a fuss about anything, truly. But Jay still had the impression that he could have had plenty to say. Jay was of pretty average height and perhaps above average weight, but he carried it well. He appeared thinner than his diet gave him any right to be. His hair was dark and seasonally short, and his beard had always grown in thicker and more quickly than that of most boys. Any time it grew long enough to annoy him, he would trim it back, sometimes down to stubble, and sometimes into whatever shape came to him in the moment. On this day, his face featured no artistically flourished sideburns or long multi-pronged beard, simply a short mustache and a goatee. For a time, his facial hair had sometimes been shaped in reaction to, or in joking competition with, Jay's. Sometimes their faces looked like complete opposites, and at other times they might just as well have been twins. That is, except for the difference in skin color. Come to think of it, Jay and Jay had talked about such things a little bit, usually while blasting aliens in Contra, or battling to pull off or prevent a hat trick in NHL 94, or clobbering their way to victory in Streets of Rage. They'd talked about the marketing for early 90s consoles, the safe and fun beige Super Nintendo, and the cool, dangerous black Sega Genesis. They'd talked about token black characters, often sidekicks in movies, and almost entirely absent from video games outside of sports titles. Jay had been pulled over and had his car interior torn apart while on his way home from getting his driver's license. He'd joked that it was the final part of driver's ed, one his white classmates must have had the sense to test out of. Jay crossed the next road and reached into his pocket. Empty. He'd forgotten to bring the newest price list. If the community college's classes had been in session, he'd be carrying his backpack and have a copy for sure. He could and would always just grab one once he got to the store, but there was something about being able to look through those lists at any time, thinking about all those electronic worlds just waiting. Some familiar, and many more mysteries, hoping to one day be tried on a whim. During the year Jay had lived with him, between the two of them, those price sheets had been left all over. They felt and looked like the lowest quality paper stock imaginable. They left ink on one's fingers. And they were magic. Jay wondered if that was part of the reason he and Jay had gotten along so well and so quickly, simply bonding over older video games. Many of their other friends, if they were into games, were all about GoldenEye on Nintendo 64 or Final Fantasy VII on PlayStation. Flashy, fancy 3D stuff. And those were fun too, but Jay always felt like they were missing the charm and magic which made the older games so special. It was hard to put his finger on what or why. The old games just had an immediacy, a directness and simplicity to them. They didn't need to spend an hour explaining themselves. You'd just start playing. The welcome, familiar synthesized instruments in the music, the consistent pixel-perfect hitboxes, the precision controls. Not to mention the lack of loading times. Weren't computers supposed to wait for humans? Not the other way around. Jay was so wrapped up in his nostalgia, he'd passed by his usual crossing. It was another couple of blocks before it would matter, but it reminded him of his father and the way he'd get lost reminiscing about his Beatles records. It was also the first time he'd missed that particular crossing since the time he'd been distracted talking with Jay about, well, older versus newer games. It had been an argument, Jay supposed, but it had never felt like they were fighting. Something more like the debates their friends taking philosophy classes were so fond of. Neither Jay had understood the appeal, but perhaps that had been down to subject matter. Purpose and meaning, ethics, and the nature of reality sounded like pretty important and profound topics until one listened to a pair of second-year philosophy minors suck all the life out of them. Sprites versus polygons, though, or the ideal controller layout, there was something the Jays could sink their teeth into. There were even the philosophical gray areas, the mixtures of fancy 3D and beautiful 2D artwork, like Guardian Heroes, the only two-player Saturn game the two Jays had played and loved together. And even after a year of nobody knowing where he had gone or why, Jay had had a point. It's not as though technology was going to get slower or more expensive, that storage capacity would get more scarce. Other than enjoying the older stuff on the cheap just for fun, there was no going back. Nintendo wasn't going to start making the old 8-bit and 16-bit systems again. Even the 64 was starting to show its age. Society doesn't go back to tapes or records once CDs are around. People used to listen to the radio, tune in every week to hear the next part of a long story. That just wasn't how things worked anymore, and realistically it never would be again. But Jay pointed out, that was okay too. More great stuff was constantly being created and released than any person could ever keep up with. So why not make the most of people's short attention spans? Battletoads was exactly as challenging and fun as the day it had come out. So why not pick it up for $5 instead of the full original $50? As it happened, Jay had eaten those words when he couldn't get past the third level, no matter how he tried. But he hadn't been wrong. Jay himself had mastered that turbo tunnel in his friend's absence, but had never gotten much farther. There it was. The little store sandwiched between its larger, less niche neighbors. Funko Land, with its individually colored letters spanned above the door, welcomed Jay inside and out of the sticky heat. "Hey, Jay," said the clerk. Jay nodded and smiled in return. The blissfully cool and dry air carried the smells of different plastics and a mixture of sweat and cheap colognes from the mostly young, mostly male people who frequented the place. He certainly should have known the familiar clerk's name by now, but it had been far too long to ask at this point. "Any word from other Jay?" he asked from behind the counter. "No, been almost a year now." "Has it? Wow, I got his Saturn here," the clerk said, nodding towards a pile of boxes. "Seriously?" Jay asked while picking up and flipping through the latest price list. Jay had joked on several occasions that he'd only get a Sega Saturn once it had come down to $30. He'd gotten his Sega Genesis plus a shoebox full of games at a garage sale for $30 and loved the thing to death. So he was convinced that that was the correct amount to pay for a console. Sure enough, a used Saturn could now be had for $29.99. Jay smiled, hoping that wherever Jay was, he was all right, and enjoying Guardian Heroes, plus whatever else had come out since they'd borrowed his cousin's deck. Jay's eyes had adjusted from the bright sunlight and could better appreciate the always familiar but always changing displays and shelves and demo stations as he meandered through the small store. It was hard to imagine anything more colorful than those walls of video game boxes, each a vivid work of art on its own. There were the crumpled boxes, the marker writing, and the layers of updated price stickers, but despite such blemishes, or perhaps with their help, looking at an entire wall of used games was, as always, a beautiful thing. A familiar swirling motion caught the corner of Jay's eye. Actraiser was starting up on the store's Super Nintendo. Jay couldn't count how many times he'd played through the first level of that game, right at that spot. He glanced down at the price sheet. Still $10. The music and effects were mesmerizing. It was one of those little worlds he'd nearly gone for, over and over, but never quite committed. He couldn't say why. He'd had more fun on that first level than he did with some games for which he'd paid plenty more. His eyes dropped from the shining title screen down to the safe, inviting beige console below. Then, as was always half the point of coming to this store, Jay made a snap decision. "You know what? Ring up the Saturn. For Jay, wherever he is. I'll keep it ready for him." The clerk smiled. "Nice. Hey, you like RPGs, right? Pick up Panzer Dragoon Saga, and for you, I'll throw in the original Panzer Dragoon." Jay's eyes narrowed as he glanced back down, scanning over the price list. $45? Nah, I'll just get Guardian Heroes for now. Oh, and Knights. Can you still throw in anything? Not really. Oh, here. The clerk slid a boxless copy of NHL All-Star Hockey across the counter. Older sports games were always super cheap, and this was no exception, but the apartment of J&J would never say no to a hockey game. Once Jay's new old games were paid for, he stuffed the new price list into the bag and prepared himself to go back out into the heat and humidity. The clerk's automatic, "Thank you, and come again," was interrupted by a sudden and loud noise. It seemed to come from the alley behind the store, perhaps something smashing into a dumpster. The puzzled clerk turned and walked into the back room and out of sight. Jay picked up his bag and was about to leave the store when he heard a panicked scream. He moved hastily through the back room door, ignoring the employees only sign in its bright red hand. It looked like somebody outside was grabbing the clerk's legs and trying to pull him through the door. He was sideways, arms grabbing at the doorknob and fighting against whoever was yanking at him. Warm air and panic flowed around him and into the small room. Jay quickly set down his bag and ran over, grabbing the clerk's arms. "Help! Pull me in!" he cried, which was easier said than done. It felt like reeling in a fish the size of a person, or maybe it felt like being the fish. Bracing against a nearby shelf which snapped off the wall, a cabinet which fell over, and finally the door itself, Jay and the clerk were eventually able to scramble inside and kick the door closed. Pinched between the door and wrapped around the clerk's ankle was a thin wire, glistening with fresh blood. More thrashing around could be heard outside, and scrapes in the now locked door suggested the wire was still being tugged at from outside. The clerk reached toward the wire which had sliced through his socks and his flesh, but immediately recoiled. "Ah, it's electrified or something," he said, shaking his hands. "Who's out there? Shit! Should I lock the front door?" Jay didn't wait for an answer, already scrambling towards the employees-only door. "Well, wait, yes, but toss me the phone first, okay?" The clerk grunted after him, anguished and exhausted. Jay continued through the door, grabbed the cordless phone from its cradle next to the cash register, spun back and made a clumsy underhand throw to the clerk, who caught it, but suddenly looked alarmingly pale. Maybe he was going into shock. His eyes were wide and he seemed frozen. A light clatter drew Jay's eyes downward. Teeth were scattered across the floor, leading toward the clerk, as if they'd somehow fallen from the phone receiver he'd just thrown. They had. They must have. Stuck to a finger of Jay's still outstretched hand was what looked and felt for the world like a person's canine tooth, root and all. Before Jay could react or yell or think, his own leg was yanked backwards, out from under him. Even with his Battletoad's turbo tunnel reflexes, Jay had no time to catch himself or prevent his head cracking against the edge of the counter. Darkness, nausea, and a fever dream of unnatural laughter spun in Jay's unconscious mind. Hazy dreams with vivid but indistinct imagery played out all around him. But he was disconnected. His controller unplugged from its socket. Low-resolution, high-intensity pain brought him both into and out of himself. He could see the bridge and hear the unsettling music. Bowser, King Koopa himself, was breathing fire and throwing a stream of hammers. If Jay could time his jump just so, landing on the axe beyond would collapse the bridge and the princess would be saved. But how did Mario always pull that off? Jumping onto a giant axe should have cut his leg off, and besides, the princess was in another castle. Life began to feel very abstract, very small. Just a stationary black game over screen counting down, his chance to continue slowly ticking away. Did he have any extra lives left? Had he lived well enough to even register on the scoreboard? J-A-Y, no initials. Why was it so quiet? What had happened to the background music? Silence. Darkness. Peace. Someone needed to blow on the cartridge contacts and start again. The world was blinking between pink and black. Jay's eyes slowly fought their way open and began to focus. There was no control deck caught in a reset loop. It was some kind of medical monitor flashing. Jay was anything but unplugged. Wires and tubes were plentiful on his arms and hand, about as clumsy as a power glove and much less cool looking. Jay started to fidget. Everything itched. As he gradually came to, some elusive thoughts drifted through his head. He was in a hospital. He was alive. He appeared to be missing his left leg. That didn't seem right, but everything was so fuzzy he couldn't be sure. He began looking around beyond his bed and realized there was someone in the room with him. He blinked slowly, hoping to clear his vision. There was a man sitting in the room, wearing a suit and reading the newspaper. Was he from a funeral home? Jay was alive. This guy could go home. It was nice of him to be there, though. Jay coughed a weak cough, and the bright haze of reflected sunlight dropped as the man set his paper down, replaced quickly by a more concentrated glare from a shiny pair of sunglasses hanging from the man's front pocket. "Jay, are you awake?" a familiar voice asked. Between the dulled reflexes, the grogginess, and the sheer surprise, it took him a moment to respond. "Jay? Jay Wilker? Is that you? Man, I would hug you if you weren't hooked up to all of this." Jay stood up, approached the bed, and took Jay's hand. "Carl says you saved his life." Jay was ecstatic to see his old friend, and had 1,000 questions, but the first was simply, Carl? From Funcoland. Carl. He said you went back in and saved his life. Said you bought my $30 Saturn, too. You miss me that much? He did. He had. You were right, Jay said, realizing his throat was very dry. Jay looked at him questioningly. There were copies of Earthbound back there, in their original oversized boxes. Jay shot back a wide grin, the old in-joke rushing back to him. He reflexively raised his hand to lightly slap Jay on the knee, but his hand fell only on a rough blanket and the mattress below. They exchanged a solemn look. Too solemn. I was just thinking I'd give my left leg to see you again. Both Jays laughed, at the joke which wasn't a joke, and at the situation which wasn't funny. So, you seem to know what I've been up to, Jay started. He couldn't finish. What about you? Where were you? What happened? Why didn't you say goodbye? There were too many questions for any of them to make it out of his mouth. Jay dragged a chair alongside the bed, sat, and leaned over. He got started on some answers, but they weren't easy or direct. Well, the good news is, I think I have a job for you, but I'll get to that in a minute. The bad news you already know. Your leg is missing. Now, the weird news is, I think I know what happened to it. The night seemed much darker on the prairie without her father there, Alice thought. The sky was cloudless, star-wild, and velvety above their still encampment. They had picked a spot closer to the river, where the hills made a natural boundary to hide from all manners of villainy. Alice's whole family was worried about leaving the wagon where it had broken down, knowing it would be a beacon for thievery, but standing nearby protecting it would be foolhardy at such a perch, since projectiles could hit them from every direction. By the water, they at least had a few mounds of grass and flowers to shield them from a screaming bullet or a whispering arrow. Alice was having a hard time sleeping. Since sundown, they had been lying down on the ground silently looking heavenwards at the dim mass of prickled light. The only sounds were the billows of wind rushing over sedges and wildflower. Occasionally, a fish jumped in the river scouring for mosquitoes. Alice was the only one awake. She could not get the bridge from earlier out of her mind. She kept on reliving it. The butterfly, the voice, the stream stopping, the frogs in her hands that helped her brother Sam catch a dozen fish. Those were some of the finest frogs I've ever had for bait. Alice, where did you get them? He had asked her while they walked back to the wagon earlier that day. Just along the banks, she said, enjoying the praise she was seldom given from her family. As Alice stared skyward, resting on her arms, she could not help but revisit the darkness beneath the bridge. The depth of those shadows was unfathomable, like they had no beginning or end, like the entire bottom of that structure was a tunnel to the furthest oblivion, to the lowest abyss on earth. It both frightened and exhilarated her. There was something primal about the way it made her feel. The void had boldness to it, a sense of freedom unhindered by society. The power of the one speaking from it was unquestionable. How could she be like them, manipulating the world around them to infinite degrees? Why did she have to be the red-headed monster at the butt of every chide in the family? It was unfair and unwarranted. Alice, a voice rasped. She sat up with a startle and looked down at the river. Staring back at her ominously was the vague outline of the bridge from before, only with an eerie red light glowing around it. Alice could not pinpoint what was making the blood color. Hello? She said. It's me, Alice. Did your bait succeed? Are you nourished? The whisper said. She paused. Yes, I am. Thank you for your kindness, Alice said, watching the structure for any glimmers of movement. Good, Alice. Can I show you something else? I want to show you how safe you really are. It shall only take a few moments, and then you may rest, the voice said. What do you want to show me? Alice said, standing up. Her family slept quietly in mounds of rising breaths and snores. I want to show you my fire, the voice said. Your fire? The bridge slightly rose into a tense spine. There are forges burning everywhere. They're hidden to you, but I get to see them all happening. They burn in the past, the present, sometimes even the future. There was a squeaking sound where the cobblestones flattened to cross the water. Something wriggled and stood up in the gloom. Thanks to the generous moonlight, Alice did not have to strain her eyes in the murkiness. It was almost as if someone was illuminating that pale planetary orb for her, like the atmosphere was focused on her specifically, an honor she'd never known in her young life. A lantern grew out of the ground beside the bridge. It stood up high, with black, thin metal holding its head, which was round and silver. Follow the light, Alice. It's okay, the voice said. Something moved behind her. It was quick but large. The ground shook to its movement. It reminded Alice of thunder, but there was not a storm cloud for miles. The lantern scurried along the river, not crossing the bridge but venturing further up the banks. That dull, bloody light made a fog of redness throughout the plains. It moved at a perfect pace, so Alice could not get lost in the weeds or underbrush. The water rushed by her right shoulder constantly, occasionally bubbling up in a noisy bit of current. There were no crickets or animals out in the plains. The night's silence was so overtly present it made Alice feel like she was walking through a graveyard. She wanted to speak her thoughts out loud, but the lantern was focused ahead, sliding between the reeds effortlessly. After a lengthy walk, they started to head uphill. The grass started to drift down to Alice's knees, and she could see farther ahead. Alice was covered in sweat, to the point that it matted down her hair across her head. The lantern stayed close enough for her to avoid prairie dog holes and rocks. Eventually they reached the peak of a tall mound, and the lantern stopped. Alice could see all around her. After a few miles of detail, there were just the vague outlines of hills and their subtle silhouettes on the foggy horizon, like an unfinished painting. The air smelled like soil, plants, and the nearby river. If Alice knew where the water was, she knew she could make it back to camp. For a few moments, there were no sounds but the uneven howl of the plains, a vacuous din that seemed to fill every moment in this reality. Then she heard it. It was a thundering sound, a quake of rapid stomping. The lantern started to quiver, its body trembled and tingled in metal clicks. Voices of men and the snorts of horses started to fill the emptiness. Across from their perch, a dozen horses were riding. They were headed toward her and the light. They were bandits, out looking for any settler's camp to pillage, rape, and assault. They were dressed in native garb to deceive any survivors who might want revenge. If not for the lantern next to her head, Alice would never have been able to see that these were white men impersonating Indians. This observation caused something to laugh aloud behind her. It was standing on the hill with her. Her mind wanted to turn and look, but her body could not be convinced. Some bestial instinct was protecting her eyes and neck from moving. I could rip them apart with one arm. But I need you to see, a voice said. It was the speaker from the bridge again. An unknown language started to be whispered behind her, like the shape was talking to others who were listening somewhere out in the windy night. The riders were getting closer. Strangely, Alice was not scared. She felt safe despite the line of hooves, rifles, and pistols glittering toward her in seismic gallops. A song of wind chimes suddenly laughed on the air. Sound seemed to stop as the notes delicately played together. The breeze turned toward them and away from the prairie, and a bolt of turquoise light cackled above Alice's head vertically. The marauders abruptly stopped and stared up at the crest of the hill. They were at its base. If they charged upwards, it would not be long before Alice would be trampled beneath their feet. Just above Alice's trembling red head, there were 3 large flames. They were similar in color to the energy that had just sizzled across the nightscape, only they were a darker blue, with bits of jagged scales moving between their licking strands of fire. They were large, at least a foot wide and 2 feet long. They floated off the ground without strings. They were beautiful. Alice was transfixed by them. They're called the Emerald Hawk Moth. The flames started to drift forward toward the bandits. They only appear when you're ready to live on, the voice said. Alice did not know what that meant. Their glows spoke to her soul on levels she didn't even understand. The bandits could see the supernatural blazes staring down at them. The horses panicked, men screamed, flashes of gunpowder rattled upwards toward them. The smell of their shots sucked the sweetness of the dark away. Their billowing clouds of violence fogged upwards like a restless volcano. Alice winced as bullets started to fly past. The air in front of her quickly became textured and laced, as though someone had dropped a curtain of nearly translucent silk just ahead of her vantage point. The missiles abruptly snagged themselves in sharp echoes of startled air. They looked like flies trapped in some otherworldly web, only they did not bother to try and wiggle and live. The sounds from their bursts and melee seemed to vanish as well, a graveyard-like silence over the plains. It's strange. If it weren't for fire, metal, and gunpowder, you would not even be out here, the voice said. The 3 flames silently rocketed up into the air above them, like they were trying to tease the stars. After a few seconds, they arched back to the ground, toward the cauldron of confused robbers. They fell onto the men in dizzying sweeps of teal energy. At first, the robbers screamed and shot at one another, hitting their horses, which whinnied endlessly. This made the voice behind Alice snarl deeply, enough to shake the ground. "Leave them be," it whispered. The Emerald Hawk Moth retreated after it touched every bandit in flashes and streaks. They stopped thrashing and looked down at their bodies quizzically. Bits of the green-blue energy were sitting on their clothes, skin, and limbs as though they were covered by some kind of parasitic fireflies. The bits of otherworldly fire didn't move. They just sat there quietly and unafraid. "We ain't burning up! Must be some sort of trick!" a robber yelled from the crowd. As if they heard him speak, the lights drifted downward along the angled earth. They formed the outline of a triangle as they moved, stopping just ahead of the men at the base of the hill. Then they started to move. They began slowly rotating counterclockwise in a steady pace. The air grew silent as they turned. The men stared. Alice stared. The whole natural world seemed to be hypnotized by the building light. Then they flew faster, spinning violently until they formed a sort of ring. The stillness of the night ended abruptly as a thrumming sound filled the air, like a large insect was hovering over the plains, beating its translucent wings. My skin! Someone screamed from the back of the mob. The remnants of light that had attached themselves to the robbers were starting to return to the vortex in a vacuous pull. Skin, hair, bones, veins, arms, throats, legs, faces, and eyes were all slowly getting pulled apart and sucked into the cyclone in wild threads of living matter, which were guided by these fragments of fire. Men tried to run, but their bodies were taken apart before they could even turn around. Clothes, hats, guns, and belts fell aside as their forms were tugged inside the circle. The pull of the portal turned their bits into fibrous strands of red-white tissue. The stench of guts and blood was putrid and salty. In just a few seconds, the robbers were all gone, leaving behind a line of confused horses, some of which were on their knees from their wounds. The flames broke apart and fluttered in different directions until they reunited just above Alice, who had not blinked since the whole spectacle began. What could she say? What could she do? Everything she'd just witnessed was beyond description to any other living person. That is just a sample of the forges and the worlds between everything, the voice said. The Emerald Hawk Moth went out abruptly. like a child whispering to the smallest candle. Alice fell to her knees. She wanted to vomit, but her body was still eerily calm. She wanted to look behind her, but couldn't. A wall was stopping her from sending even her eyes to the corners of her head. "You're not yet ready to witness me," the voice said. There was more uneven weight shaking the ground. "Walk ahead of me, my friend, so she doesn't have to see me. I must see to the animals." The lantern scurried in front of Alice, ready to return her to camp along the river. The wind whistled a lonely howl across the oceans of dark, wrinkled grasses.
They're dead. They're all gone," Alice said, trying to close her eyes.
There was a pause and a slight growl. "Do not pity the dead, Alice. Their problems are over. Pity the living." The earth went silent. A bit of sadness sat on the breeze. "The ones left behind," the voice said. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Dawn, and Owen Swerkstrom. The story Sparks, written by Robert Dawn. Missing, by Owen Swerkstrom. The Emerald Hawk Moth, by Patrick W. Marsh. The voice of Hidden Oaks, performed by Robert Dawn. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Find more of his works at dtschwartz.com. Produced by Robert Dawn, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. You can find out more online by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at Hidden Oaks Pod, as well as Facebook and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thank you for listening, and until next time.